stuff. It was a really interesting interview.
It was really interesting.
Welcome to CNN Talk.
We're
Caught them out.
discussing Max's tie.
We were, actually.
Big news.
Is it central enough? That's our big question.
Is it veering too far to the left in a popular
Never.
surge?
Farwell, sorry, it's not normally like this. Farwell's is joining us. He's normally on much more grown-up shows.
Fun. Who cares about it? The world is going to a million pieces, so let's
A bit of equality, a bit of lightness.
Stephen Bush also with us. Thank you for joining us. There's been an escalation in rhetoric around, whether or not Iran was involved in this latest attack in this Gulf of Oman. I mean, how concerned have you been about what you've seen develop this week?
Well, I think it's been concerning for a while, the growing escalation in rhetoric from the Trump administration and from Trump himself. And the great hope, of course, is because he is very much a president who is led by the last person he's spoken to, then he will continue to speak to people who don't want a conflict with Iran. I think this does feel like an incident which may lead to a full-scale conflict, which would be far greater a level of commitment on the US's part than any of George W. Bush's wars, and would have huge reverberations, not just in the Middle East, but also I think the particular concern to me is what it means for people in Eastern Europe.
Isn't that the conversation we so often have, though, with any sort of uptick in rhetoric in the Middle East? I mean, how concerned are you about another war in the Middle East?
I am very much concerned about developments in the Gulf and the region in the past 1 year. If you ask me what's the most dangerous theater in the world today, I would say it's the Gulf and the Middle East. It's not North Korea, it's not the Indian-Pakistani borders. It would take a spark to trigger a huge confrontation. Why? Because you have, both sides view the conflict in existential terms, Iran and Saudi Arabia. The security of the elites is at stake. They're terrified that somehow the survival of the regimes at stake. And that's why you have multiple players, multiple variables that could converge and create a huge fire.
The question we're asking you, Gulf tanker attacks, what are the implications? Let us know. Let us know where you're writing from as well. I mean, one of the immediate implications has been the oil price, hasn't it? Whatever happened in the Gulf, we've seen the oil price go up.
Yeah, the geopolitical implications are very much in the balance, and I agree with Stephen. It's a really alarming situation. The oil price jumped up 4% yesterday when news of these two tankers, one of them Japanese-owned, at a time when Shinzo Abe is in Iran as part of an attempt by Tehran to reach out to a US ally. The oil price came up off quite low levels. But what struck me in the last 24 hours since this happened is just how many people have been prepared to say openly that they're not sure if this was Iran. I'm seeing credible people talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, the incident in the mid-60s that drew the US into the Vietnam War, which when the USS Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese forces, most historians say those claims were false, and Robert McNamara and Lyndon Johnson were wrong, and so went into Vietnam on false premise. But be in no doubt, Trump's reputation is on the line here. He's quite close to being a president who goes through a whole term without actually being in a war for all his belligerence. That could end now, and Europe really doesn't like it. Europe is still in there with the Obama-era 2015 anti-proliferation deal. Massive French and German business interests in Iran, which, after all, is the biggest emerging market in the world, which has yet to emerge.
There are those who suggest this is non-Iranian players trying to make it look as if it is Iran. What do you think about that?
Well, look, I hold no candle for the Iranian regime, particularly on their human rights records, and particularly as a sort of a Muslim woman. But I do feel that, I have some kind of sympathy with the way this is sort of playing out. The genesis of this is the Iran nuclear deal. The thing that people forget is that Iran actually didn't do anything wrong, though inspectors and the experts went in and said that Iran had not actually breached any of the terms of this nuclear agreement, which lots of people have skin in the game in, including the EU, in terms of opening up markets in Iran.
We're talking about the Gulf tanker attacks. What are the implications? The question for you today.
The Trump administration is flatly accusing Iran of attacking 2 tanker ships. It happened in broad daylight as the ships sailed through the Gulf of Oman.
One of them, the Front Altair oil tanker, reported 3 explosions. The second, the Japanese-owned chemical tanker, was attacked twice with, quote, some sort of shell.
There were 44 people on board. They have been taken to safety. 1 person was injured. There are no casualties.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is blaming Iran directly.
Iran is lashing out because the regime wants our successful maximum pressure campaign lifted.
The attacks came as Japan's prime minister was meeting with Iran's supreme leader. Iran's foreign minister tweeting, quote, "Suspicious doesn't begin to describe what likely transpired this morning."
Within hours of this attack, oil prices skyrocketed. All of this tension in the Persian Gulf region could cost all of us more at the gas tank.
On Facebook, Isabel says it would be incredibly stupid if Iran orchestrated the attack on a Japanese tanker when PM Shinzo Abe of Japan is in Tehran, as he is, for this big visit. And Heidi says this is why we have got to stop using fossil fuel. Liam, we've seen the oil price spike this week. That's been the very real impact of it so far.
Yeah, the oil price spiked 4% yesterday, albeit off 5-month lows. And as we just heard on the tape there, Trump will be sensitive as campaigning starts for 2020 that, you know, at the most base level, that will lead to more Americans spending more when they fill their cars. But you know, the Straits of Hormuz, they're 36 miles wide. This is, if you like, is the throat of the world economy.
We've got the shipping routes for you here.
1/5 of all oil traded in the world, 1/3 of all seaborne oil passes through because it's the gateway to the Persian Gulf and all the big oil powers there. What strikes me as interesting is how many people have been prepared to say that they're not actually sure that Iran has done this. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me at a time when Rouhani, the moderate Prime Minister of Iran, and even some of the hardline Ayatollahs, Khatami, the supreme leader, are meeting with the Japanese because the Japanese are a US ally. They're not a signatory to the non-proliferation agreement, which Trump has taken the US out, signed in 2015. But the Japanese are, of course, a key US ally. And either this is, you know, people say that America benefits, Israel benefits, others that want to put pressure on Iran. Others are saying, oh, it's Iranian hardliners like the Revolutionary Guard that don't want this peace effort between Tehran and a major US ally.
Faraz Georges, you know, our Middle East guru on CNN is here. I mean, when people question whether or not it was Iran, I mean, what's your response to that?
Before we speculate, Max, there is no smoking gun. There are no fingerprints.
There's the video.
Even though the Americans in May and now point the finger towards Iran. And they have the American military release the video showing that some Iranians are removing an item from one of the tankers.
Which they say could be a mine.
Unexploded.
We have, what I'm trying to say, I'm not saying Iran did not do it. All I'm saying is that before we speculate, we have to wait for the evidence. It's a very important thing. I'm an academic. The question for me, I mean, there are 2 questions, Max.
That's
you
the
asked
mine, sorry, being taken off the ship, which they think was the Iranians taking away the evidence.
Yeah.
An unexploded mine.
How do I explain it to your own viewers?
Yes.
Are Iranian leaders, Max, that trackless to provide fuel for the hardliners within the Trump administration to really attack Iran? Iran would be the major loser in any particular confrontation. That is, if Iran had committed the act, this would be a very reckless and a very dangerous escalation. On the other hand, let me turn the table on its head. If I, seriously, from an offensive realism school, if I were sitting in Iran, probably I would be engaged in what I call a calculated, dangerous escalation. Because I'm bleeding, my economy is hurt, my people are starving, I'm going to send messages to enemies and rivals that I have options. If I cannot export my oil, you cannot export your oil, I'm going to raise the stake. This is a very, so really we have to wait for the evidence, but you can see it from both sides.
It's interesting because the European nations are being very careful about coming out in complete support of the US because they want to assess the intelligence themselves. Is that telling
Yeah,
for you?
I think that's very telling. I think everybody needs to sort of approach this with caution. I think just because, you know, Mike Pompeo has absolutely blamed Iran, that does not mean that that is the case closed for the sort of prosecution. And remember, like, you know, Britain and other countries in the EU have had to tread quite carefully around this tearing up of the Iran nuclear deal because they were very, very much part of that. They felt it was a very, very good thing for Iran to be sort of brought in to, you know, the world of, you know, commercial success. We had lots of European countries saying, you know, we had, you know, Iran on the cover of Luxury Style magazine saying this could be the tourist hotspot destination for you to go to. So there was quite a lot of financial skin in the game. And going back to what I was saying in the Facebook thing, look, Iran is, you know, I have a lot of issues with the Iranian regime in terms of their human rights, how they sort of treat women. But I do think it's very interesting that you have this alliance again, the old alliance, America, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all lining up against Iran at this particular point. Remember, there was no evidence from the weapons inspectors that Iran had breached their terms of the deal, the nuclear deal. That's now just been completely ripped up. That's created all this instability. There's been a lot of heated sort of rhetoric. And, you know, Iran is not isolated as well. Iran has powerful figures behind it as well. So you're absolutely right. This is a very tinderbox sort of situation. Iran's a very proud country as well, and it's not going to take well to being bullied or to sort of being framed by, like, you know, falsely attacking this liner.
Stephen Bush joins us today as well. This from El Mehdi on Facebook. If it wasn't Iran, who was it? And then we've got this as well from Johan saying, attacking friends whilst disguised as the enemy has been used as an excuse to go to war more than one time in history. Is that worth remembering?
It is worth remembering, right? You know, almost all historians now accept the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which started the Vietnam War, was at best a misread of what had happened, right? So, yeah, we're not talking about far-out conspiracy theories here, we're talking about history. But I think the more important thing here is not who is behind this attack, but what are the potential, you know, world-shattering implications of this conflict escalating. It has implications in the Middle East itself. It has implications for the proxy war being fought between the US, Iran, Russia and Israel in Syria. And it, of course, has implications in Europe, partly because of the interests that EU powers have, but also what is going to happen if US power is caught in a quagmire, and it would be a very long, bloody quagmire in the Middle East. Probably Russia uses that moment to entrench its advantage in bits of the Ukraine and maybe in the Baltic states as well.
I mean, that's the world we're operating in, with the Western powers pulling out of conflicts and not wanting to go in, and the Russians showing that they do want to step into international situations.
Let's talk about the good news. The good news is that neither Donald Trump nor the Iranians want war. I mean, they have made it very clear. In fact, the reason why the Prime Minister, the Japanese Prime Minister, was in Tehran was to deliver a message by Trump to the Iranian leadership that even though the Americans are waging an economic war against Iran, the Americans have no interest in all-out confrontation. But we teach our students, I mean, I teach at the LSE, that war comes not because, I mean, players want war. War comes by accident, by miscalculation. What you are seeing now is that multiple players have stakes in this particular conflict. You have multiple players within state and also among the stakeholders. And in fact, what I fear the most, and I've said it earlier, is that you have the conflict in the Gulf now is seen as existential. Both the Saudis and the Iranians view the conflict as really about regime survival. And that's why it would take trigger to really, a spark to trigger a major confrontation by accident.
We talk about, you talk about Iran having allies. I mean, obviously Russia as well, and the leaders of those countries are meeting. Does that concern you that this is going to end up being a battle between the US and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, it does concern me because, let's be honest, right, there's a lot of bad guys involved in this. We have multiple players here. None of them, I think, are acting in, you know, geopolitical good faith. And you're completely right. Often war happens because of irrational actors and because things get in the way, misinformation, disinformation, you know, wanting to, you know, save face. And look, we have a lot of hotheads involved in this as well. Not so long ago, you know, we talked about on this programme and everybody was trying to de-escalate the conflict. And then Donald Trump suddenly sort of tweeted and the rhetoric again. So I think we're in a very volatile situation, and everybody knows on paper that any kind of conflict would be a really bad idea for all the reasons that sort of Stephen has said. But we know that sometimes, particularly in the world we're living in right now, what happens on paper is very different to what happens in people's kind of heads in the moment.
To the question of Russia, because I didn't answer the question. I think Russia has been the main beneficiary in the past 8 years of America's disengagement or retrenchment from the Middle East. Syria has been the stage on which Russia really displayed its power. Russia is not going to come to the defense of Iran, make no doubts about it, but Russia will benefit from any kind of confrontation. It will fill the vacuum, the strategic vacuum. And Iran is becoming more and more now attracted to Russia and China. So America's moves, or lack of moves, on the one hand, it wages an economic war against Iran. On the other hand, the Trump administration want to really bring the troops home. Afghanistan, Syria is not. So there is a major tension within American strategy. On the one hand, the rhetoric is very hype, is very intense. On the other hand, Trump is not interested in waging a war because he wants to win re-election. He wants, and his base does not really want war.
Liam, we're just going to bring up the oil shipping traffic in the Gulf of Oman, because that really illustrates the point that you were speaking to earlier about the importance of this space.
Yeah, as I said earlier, a third of all seabound oil in the world goes through this 36-mile channel.
The two ships we're circling, by the way, are the two involved in this latest incident.
That's right, and it's interesting that one of them is Japanese-owned at a time when Shinzo Abe, as we've said, has been in Tehran. And it's not just moderates like President Rouhani meeting this US ally. It's not just the Foreign Minister Javad Zarif meeting Shinzo Abe. It's also the theocrats. It's also the supreme leaders, particularly Khamenei, who really does wield the power. It's the Revolutionary Guard who have given their oversight and blessing to this meeting by Shinzo Abe. And what we're seeing now, and it may be a false flag operation, Stephen Bush is absolutely right. The historical analysis of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, this is not people in basements posting things on YouTube. These are serious scholars saying that the Gulf of Tonkin was not the North Vietnamese attack on the USS Maddox that Robert McNamara said at the time that it was, and history would have been different. Is this a similar operation? We just don't know. The question, what really strikes me is that credible people are prepared to suggest that this may be some kind of a false flag operation.
Tweeted this for the Iranian side, that the US immediately jumped to make allegations against Iran without a shred of factual or circumstantial evidence, only makes it abundantly clear that the B team is moving to Plan B. Sabotage diplomacy, including by Shinzo Abe, and cover up economic terrorism against Tehran, bringing a lot of factors in there, but that's an argument that a lot of people would see as making sense.
Yeah, it's an argument that will be hugely, will be listened to by people in the Middle East, will be listened to particularly by people here in Europe, where there's
conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, and people will feel, oh, what this guy is saying is, look, actually, this is about the US wanting a war with Iran, about John Bolton seeing it as unfinished business, and actually you can't trust what the Americans are saying. Now, that could be true, could be false.
We don't know.
We don't know, but I think the important thing is a lot of people will feel like it's true, and it makes it very difficult, even allowing the economic reasons. Europe does not want to get involved in this theatre. Politically, I don't think any European nation would feel that it could survive going into Iran with this White House.
Also, Trump's often accused of underestimating Iran, a very intellectual sort of leadership there who don't respond well to these sorts of pushers. You know, they're not pushers.
Well, absolutely. They're very thoughtful and strategic people. I mean, just look at the kind of the depth of that text. You know, there's so much you could pull out of that text. It was so clever. It got into the subtext of the fact that, like, Bolton and Pompeo were seen as Team B, they're more hawkish. I mean, compared to the nonsense we get, you know, in capital letters from the president. So, yeah, I think the Iranians will be a lot more sort of strategic. And in a way, in some ways, they have far less to lose than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump We know he likes to be muscular on the world stage whenever it works for him quite well. We call it the dead cat strategy quite often on the show. Whenever he's having difficulties at home, he can, haha, look what I'm doing kind of overseas. But you are correct. With his re-election coming up, he's got a trade war with China, which is going to start squeezing his base in terms of actual prices and possibly sort of their jobs. Does he really want to sort of get a hair running? Because he's just about got the North Korea thing under control, although let's be honest, nothing has actually happened positively on North Korea.
There's been no dividend yet. There's been no dividend.
Does he really want to get another serious hair running, giving it the big one with the Iranians, and then where does he go after that?
You can't...
Please, may I play the devil's advocate just for a minute? Because really to just take from what both of you have said, this is where you see all our discussion really is based on perceptions, misperceptions, calculation, miscalculation, moves by the various players. And this is where so many unknown variables. And this is why the danger lies. The danger lies in the fact that you're right. The Iranian leader's reading of the Trump administration is that really he does not want war. He's mainly, and that's why, even though we don't have the evidence, if I were in the shoes of the Iranian leadership, I would engage in a calculated escalation in order to lessen the pain, to send messages. Remember, people, Iran is hurting. The Iranian economy now is bleeding. The Iranian, rial has lost 50% of its value.
But when you said people are starving there,
yes,
there are people that would dispute that.
And not only that, Max, we need to also understand the impact of the economic sanctions on the social context in Iran itself. The protests, young people are fed up, the unemployment. So this is why, the way the Iranian leaders perceive the sanctions, that they're existential to their survival, could really basically influence the decision to challenge and this is why the danger lies.
We're going to go to break, but we can, if you're on Facebook, you can hear what he was about to say. So tune in there.
I've forgotten now. These sanctions really undermine the whole attempt by Rouhani to engage with the rest of the world. Rouhani, a moderate bloke who's got a PhD from a Scottish university, speaks perfect English. I wouldn't say he's pro-Western, but he's certainly pro-Western engagement. And the sanctions, with America reneging on a deal that Iran didn't renege on, Aisha's completely right, that's what the IAEA says, the Atomic Energy Agency, that undermines this whole idea of moderation and engaging with the rest of the world. It gives the whip hand to the Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollahs and the theocrats. And Javed Zarif, you just had there, the Iranian foreign minister, a Rouhani ally, a moderate. That really is a cry for help, that tweet. The B team, of course, refers to John Bolton, Mohammed bin Salman, the leader in waiting, if you like, of the Saudis, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been re-elected in Israel. A triumvirate which the Iranians think want conflict with Iran. I don't think Trump does want conflict with Iran, and I think in the end this will blow over. But it could look a lot worse before it looks better.
The Israeli elections are actually a really interesting subplot here. The government has collapsed, having failed to reach a coalition deal after the election in February. Bibi is, of course, immersed in allegations of corruption. Now, what is the most powerful card he can play against?
We're discussing the Gulf tanker attacks. What are the implications? Mike Pompeo broke it down to this. It is the assessment of the US government that Iran is responsible for today's attacks in the Gulf of Oman. So that's his assessment of the intelligence. A lot of people not supporting the US on our Facebook feed. Tim Sarrazin says, sanctions, sanctions, then war. That's what he sees happening. David says the US can no longer be trusted. And Ranjith says, when I see the video, it reminds me of the weapons of mass destruction video from Saddam's Iraq.
Yeah, it does show, one, the fatigue and distrust of the US military establishment, particularly its neoconservative wing, thanks to the Iraq War, and particularly because of Donald Trump and the way he's seen throughout the world. And remember, the Iraq War was popular at the beginning in large parts of the world. This is one of the reasons why this would be a much more tricky and intractable conflict. One of the reasons why I think probably the calculation that Trump doesn't really want war may be correct, but of course no one wanted war in 1914.
If a war if there's talk of a war though, and you know, the US would traditionally have gone in and stepped in, and they don't this time, what does that actually mean?
Well, it's very difficult because sometimes once the sort of jungle drums get going about war, then you're kind of sort of slightly, the situation can be out of control and war can happen as an unintended consequence. But one of the things that I think a lot of people have real concerns about is, as you rightly say, the situation in Iran is very, very fragile. And as Liam says, you know, regime change is something that the Americans could have an eye on. However, let's be honest, American attempts at a regime change in the Middle East have not gone so well in kind of recent living memory. And I think a lot of people are understandably sceptical about that. And, you know, you often hear some of the Americans saying, well, look, you know, we would, if regime change happened as an unintended consequence, that would be good because Iran is a bad country. It's like, hang on a minute, you can't say Iran is a bad country and then say that Saudi Arabia is okay. That is absolute hypocrisy because Saudi Arabia is your ally.
But Saudi's getting a lot more support, isn't it? That's the point. AB pointing out on Facebook that Iran is being ganged up against. That's the perception, and that's what the perception that works for them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, again, to come back to Iran, Iran now finds itself in the eye of the storm. I mean, we should not underestimate the gravity of the economic war that the United States is waging against Iran. There is not even a single state in the world that still basically buys Iranian oil. India, China, Japan, Turkey, even Turkey, South Korea. It's starving, and this has major implications on the internal dynamics in Iran itself. So even though the Trump administration says it does not really want regime change, it wants to change the conduct of Iran. What's the difference between the two? Because that means they want Iran to surrender. But to come back to the big point, the context, why are we talking about Iran and the Gulf now? Why are we talking about the likelihood of war? There is a question that we all need to ask ourselves, because the Trump administration, President Trump, pulled out of an international agreement that was signed by his predecessor, that is Barack Obama and 6 great powers. This is the context. And that's why my hope is that, sanity and wisdom will prevail. My fear, Max, and this is not just pontification, my fear is that the United States, by calling on the Security Council, they're preparing for retaliation. We have many voices in the United States. Yesterday, read Fox News. They're calling on the Trump administration to retaliate militarily. I could easily imagine retaliation against a target in Iran, and this would basically trigger another retaliation and escalation.
Do you think Trump really wants that? Do you really think he'd go for it? I think he likes to bring the neocons in the US, the military and defense establishment in the US. They don't trust Trump. He's not one of them. He's a wide boy from New York. He's a playboy. But he has to bring them a certain part of the way.
But look at the team around, Donald Trump. Who leads the Iranian foreign policy now? It's Bolton. Sure. It's Pompeo. It's also people in the State Department. And this is, the question is, and also when they play on his ego and his pride, that somehow Iran is challenging your basically promise that you need to retaliate. America's credibility is online, the red line, pointing out to Barack Obama and the Syria's chemical weapons. And I could easily imagine that the United States retaliates in a limited way, but this limited retaliation could trigger another, and this is where war comes in.
It's definitely a danger.
The other option is regime change within the country, but what would that look like? And would it work for the Americans?
I mean, I don't think it would work for the Americans.
Because it become more conservative.
It becomes more conservative. Also, the democratic pressures that concern America in the wider region, and indeed concern MBS, of course, are the winds of democratic change. So even if there was, and also, let's face it, the history of all of these changes throughout the Arab Spring is you have a violent military reprisal from the ruling elite, and you end up with an intractable failed state such as the one which has been the result of the Syrian civil war. So it doesn't really fix the US's problem. I think the fear with Trump is, I think Liam's exactly right, he is not a neoconservative by instinct, but he is a man who takes on the views of whoever has sat on him most recently. He had one meeting with Obama and he was talking afterwards about how he quite liked Obamacare. Some Republicans came and sat on him and flattered his ego for a bit, and he decided he disliked Obamacare. Who are the people in the room flattering his ego? That's exactly right. It's Pompeo, it's Bolton.
It's difficult to see who's going to deflate the tension here, isn't it? It just seems there's so many people interested in escalating.
Trump and deflate do not go
also, the people around him. If you're talking about these other countries and the neocons, they're not going to allow it to deflate,
I mean, John Bolton, particularly, was brought in because he's so sort of hawkish. Iran is like America's #1 traditional enemy in the Middle East. There's so much kind of history there. You don't need to be an expert in politics that's happening now to know that America has always had a historically bad, very bad blood between the two things. And I do think that it may well be, though, that if the Iranians are kind of want to push Donald Trump's sort of emotional pin code, they could keep winding him up. They could just keep winding him up with tweets, with kind of social media, with posturing, and that could wind up the B team, and that could wind up Donald Trump. And that's the thing, it's so volatile at the moment. And actually, maybe in Iran, they might get to the point where they think, look, if they're being squeezed so hard that they do feel that America is trying to do regime change by stealth, they might call America's bluff and say, if you want to do this properly, come on in.
You know what Syria showed us? Syria showed us that America isn't in control anymore. The Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians basically won the Syrian conflict, albeit at huge human cost and tragedy for the 5 million displaced plus Syrian people. And if this is a false flag operation, if this is a repeat of Gulf of Tonkin, I think it's quite a desperate measure by the US establishment to once again try and impose its point of view in the Middle East, because, as I say, so many credible people, the German government immediately saying, we don't actually believe this. Yeah. That's new. That's new.
British intelligence seems to believe it.
I mean, look, we don't want to go the other way around.
Sure.
I mean, we don't have the evidence. We have to wait. But we don't want to go and really traffic in basically speculative conspiracy.
You haven't got time to wait for the evidence.
We have to wait. But again, a point, I want to play the devil advocates. I mean, Iran is not, we're not talking about saints here. Iranian leaders are not saints.
Absolutely.
I mean, Iranian behavior, look at Syria. I mean, who bankrolled Assad? Who maintained Assad's in power? I mean, the Islamic Republic of Iran spent billions of dollars and blood in order to maintain Assad in power. In Iraq, in Yemen, other places, Iranian behavior has done a great deal of damage to the regional architecture and security.
We'll keep talking about it here and also on the Facebook feed. Thank you for watching.